Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the public assurance meeting on Monday, the 12th of June. There's a number of items we will go through today, including the crime performance and exceptions report and some specific areas for discussion, including the recent force peel inspection, the Home Office counting rules and the force annual plan. Firstly, before we do anything else, have we received any apologies for the meeting, please?
Just
Yes,
just
Chief.
one. I think you've got ACC Coulson shown as attending. She is next door, but there's a few pressing operational issues she's working on. So if we do need her, I'll bang on the door and call her in. But otherwise, hopefully we can accept her apologies.
No, we certainly wouldn't want to get in the way of the operational running of the force, so we'll leave her to it if we can.
Yep.
But thank you for that. Any other apologies we need to record? Is everybody
No
else?
other apologies received.
Wonderful. Okay. So on that, just brief update from me, really. Two elements I wanted to cover off today. Firstly, the most significant thing I think that's happened in recent times around Lincolnshire is the Home Office proposals to use RAF Scampton to house migrants who have entered the country. Those plans by the Home Office still continue to be formed, it's fair to say. So I know that operationally that senior officers have been involved in working through some of the detail of what's required from an operational point of view to make anything that happens there to be safe and operationally sound, and you may want to comment on that later, Chief. But from my point of view, I've worked with local government leaders to make sure that on a regular basis we've been keeping in touch to make sure that all of the processes, as far as we're aware of them, have been worked through to make sure that the residents are supported, make sure that they feel safe and will be safe, but also that the individuals that will be housed there are obviously going to be treated with appropriate dignity and supported to make sure that they're not victimised while they're here in Lincolnshire. There's a lot of work ongoing with that, including I know the Chief and I have directly been speaking with ministers over a number of weeks, and that we're almost at the point of conclusion there regarding what support can be provided for the police regarding the Scampton situation, but also wider policing issues. So we will no doubt make an announcement on that as soon as we can. But that's the first issue, and just to reassure the public that obviously we're at the centre of those discussions to make sure that Scampton, if it is to happen, is dealt with as safely as possible. The second thing is just regarding the very recent report from the Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Andy Cook. The full, if you like, read through and ultimately decisions that will be taken regarding the state of policing report that he has launched are yet to happen. But it's really to say that there are a number of things that are mentioned in there, some of which I think will be welcomed by the policing system, and some of which I think the detail will want to be gone through before any conclusions are drawn. There are some references made in particular to areas that police and crime commissioners currently have primacy in, not least of which where legislation is clear about the appointment, for example, of Chief Constable. So there are a wide-ranging set of recommendations in there, but we'll be working locally and nationally to work through them to understand exactly what they mean for Lincolnshire residents and policing as a whole. So that's all I was going to say by way of opening comments today. Have we received any public questions at all?
No public questions have been received.
Okay, in which case we'll move straight on to item 5 then, which is the crime performance and exceptions report. So over to you, Chief.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. probably kind of led me into the things I was going to talk about most, which was firstly, and Julia will come on to the performance dashboard in a moment and the exceptions there. Scampton, I think we've covered. There's been an awful lot of work both on the part of yourself and your team and my team here. We feel like we're making some inroads there and have been met with a sympathetic and empathetic ear with the policing minister, but await confirmation on where that might take us. The operational impact of it we continue to work through, and that isn't just the operational impact for Scampton, but actually what this means for maintaining and protecting our wider establishment to police Lincolnshire in its broadest sense. So I won't go any further than that, other than to say there's a lot of work going on. The state of policing, you're right, is my desk to talk about today. It's here. There's a lot in there that you can't argue with. There's other bits that I think are more contentious. And the other thing to bear in mind is actually there's a similar report that's come out for the fire and rescue service recently, which may lead to some opportunity around further collaboration. So Marc, Baxter and myself met last week to just talk about what that might mean, and just trying to reinvigorate our strategic collaboration board to look at whether there is any crossover and opportunity there. At this point in time, I have no specifics on that. We don't know whether it's actually doable or viable, but it's something that we would want to explore in terms of the state of policing and state of the fire service as well. So there's an opportunity there. Couple of exception pieces. As the summertime comes on and we start to hit the holiday period, and we've had some really good weather, we're starting to see a small uptick in our serious accidents. So we just need to keep an eye on that. There's a fatal over the weekend, and we've had a couple last week as well. Again, avoidable accidents seem to be related to speed, and again we've got motorcycles involved in certain, probably about 30 to 40% of these accidents there are motorcycles involved. So the road policing team will be picking that up. And then the final part is that the summer policing campaign gets underway. That does require additional policing and additional resources. So we are filling that to the best of our ability with the resources we have at the moment, but we still have 106, I think it is, probationers who are not yet qualified for independent patrol. They do help build the numbers, and they will be present on the streets, and they'll be double crewed. So there will still be that police presence, but it does mean that our overall flexibility is somewhat restricted by those numbers. I've just got to make a special mention really for Lee St Quinton over on the east, because he's put this together. It is a very, very thorough summer policing campaign, probably better planned than anything we've had in the past. And I'll be going over there during the summer just to see how those patrols and that operation is running. So it's just to keep you aware that that's what's coming up. And otherwise, I think you've covered the two main bits, which is state of policing and Scampton. So I'll hand to Julia now, who I think will take you through the issues coming out of the performance dashboard.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? No, I'm trying to share my screen. I don't know if it is sharing or not. Now, and just to reassure you, I'm not going to go through every detail on every slide, but I just thought it might be helpful, having got this dashboard, to sort of use it as the template that we'll talk to. So if I can get it to move on, hang on. So the dashboard, I know, is in the template that you'll be familiar with. Starting off on there, page 4, with the 4 strategies. So always useful just to go back and remind ourselves that's what we're working towards in terms of making Lincolnshire safe. And then in terms of performance, you'll see these are the performance priorities, which are then reflected also in the annual plan. And I know there's a lot of priorities there, but sort of not really apologetic for that. These are our priorities for this coming year. You'll see in there sort of new priorities that perhaps we didn't have last year around reducing mental health demand on policing, obviously reducing rural crime. That's an ongoing one, in addition to the investment that we've already made in the rural crime team. Looking at our outcomes for victims and particularly our outcomes for victims for women and girls. So this is very much for this focus for this coming year, looking at some of the opposite areas, some of those national drivers. And then, as you know, we're baselining this year the confidence measure locally, the confidence measure in policing, which I think actually feeds in quite nicely with the State of the Nation thing, where we're talking about real reductions in confidence. So we're doing that baselining piece here, because having not had the data come through in the last few years in terms of the crime survey, in terms of the national crime survey, we're doing that local piece here, and I know that complements your surveying as well. So they're the priorities. I thought it's just probably worth just, you know, formally should have gone through and mentioned that, and that is a longer list than we've had before, but this is what we're focusing on in terms of operational delivery in the coming year. In terms of the actual overview of performance, we'll get into a little bit more detail, and I know you'll have questions to ask, and I just think perhaps you might want to, I was going to go through these, but stop me at any point if you wanted to. So what this performance overview gives us is the pre-COVID sort of comparison, and then the last 12-month comparison. And I suppose what I'd pull out of here, and I'll come on and talk about in a bit more detail, but is issues around the 101. So we know the non-emergency performance in terms of abandonment rate, so still tracking higher than we would want to for the last 12 months, but actually tracking less than the pre-COVID baseline. So actually our performance in terms of abandoned 101 is better than it was then, but still nowhere near good enough. And other ones that I was just going to pull out here, and we'll come and talk about, is around neighbourhood crime. So you can see here, hopefully you can see the sort of the cursor here on the red. So the 12-month year-on-year increase in neighbourhood crime, we'll come and look at that, how that impacts in terms of national performance. So one that we're very much aware of in terms of that increase, but just looking at the comparison of the pre-COVID. So this is the sort of national coming back into not crime as usual, but that we did expect to see some increases after getting back to normal after COVID. So, and then moving on to, and we will come back to deal with these. Oh, sorry, one I hadn't picked out here is just at the top, the volume of 999 calls. So again, 10% increase in 999 calls year on year, which represents a 24% increase compared to pre-COVID. So really significant increases in 999, and just obviously trying to manage that and maintain performance in the emergency area. And then moving on to this second slide, and the things I was really going to pull out here was around mental health incidents. So again, we're seeing that this will come in. I know you want to talk I think around you know, what we're doing around some of this, and you saw reduction in mental health demand as part of our priorities. So we're still sort of 30% up in terms of mental health incidents compared to where we were 12 months in, and that's a 90% increase compared to pre-COVID. So we do know that's a real priority area for us to look at in terms of our demand. So they're kind of the headline bits that we will come back and look at perhaps in a little bit more detail. Just wanted to, again, you know, whilst we always focus on the areas we need to improve, and quite rightly so, I suppose these are just some anecdotes or bits of good news stories that we've had since the last public assurance meeting, and obviously these aren't the only good news stories, but just really a selection of really good results. You'll see the man that was given the community order for the lead theft from churches, so part of this group of people going around, and that's a really significant issue, as we know, for our local communities, and somebody that we've managed to catch and deal with. Along with dealing with drugs, dealing with significant frauds, dealing with robbery. So some really sort of good stuff that's the business as usual, but I think actually worth flagging here when we're talking about performance in the round. So just to move on then, just to go into a little bit more detail. So obviously the Chief's vision and one of those objectives is to stop crime in ASB. So just looking at our overall performance for crime in ASB, so we look at the statistical levels of increase or otherwise, and whilst there's a lot of red on here, actually when you start looking at some of the statistical you know, and the volumes and whether that's intolerance or not. And some of that is that in line with what's happening nationally as well? Because some of this, as you know, is around crime recording. So what we see here, the ones that we're talking about in terms of being out of tolerance, are rape, which has seen an increase. So quite a significant increase in domestic abuse over the last since COVID. And we know that a significant amount, so about a quarter of our rapes are reported as domestic abuse. So the increases that we've seen are consistent with those increases in domestic abuse, basically. So, but that is actually out of tolerance. So whilst it's pretty static for the last year, so a static picture, we're still sort of saying actually that is out of tolerance, and it's an area of real priority for us, just looking at the rate. Now, some of rape reporting, as you know, will be about the confidence of victims to come forward, and to report domestic abuse, then reporting both recent and historic rape offences. As I think I've reported previously at PAM meetings, we go into all of these and look for any patterns or any issues associated with them, and I'm happy that there are, you know, that this isn't about a series of rapes that we've not picked up. So so that's one there that sits outside of tolerance. And then shoplifting on the next part of the slide, and I think again I've briefed you here previously around the shoplifting and the work we're now doing with neighbourhood teams to take a problem solving approach to that. And we've spoken about particular shops and businesses that are areas of key focus and hotspots for us, so working with them. Just moving on to the next slide, overall recorded crime then. So we are still increasing, so nearly 60,000 on the year, and I won't read the stats out, you can see them in terms of the increases in recorded crime. We expect that this will, I think the Chief has just alluded to the summer period coming up, so we do expect to see some increases, but actually, and I don't get into the whole counting rules bit, but I do expect us to start seeing recorded crime reducing as a result of the changes to the Home Office counting rules. So what won't be reducing is the recorded number of victims, but what will reduce will be the amount of crime that we are recording. So I think in the summer months we can expect to still see a peak that that is associated to drinking and the nighttime economy and the influx of huge amounts of people. But I do predict that we will start seeing some reductions here as we go through the rest of the year, and some of those reductions will show in violence offences. Again, I won't get into the detail of the Home Office counting rules unless you want to talk about them now, but some of these things will be where we will be recording the primary offence other than the ensuring that we're not recording both offences, which might lead us, violence without injury, we might be recording the course of conduct offence in primary to the lesser offence, lesser assault. So I think this is really a watching brief, I think, over the summer. So we do expect there's going to be an increase. The Chief's already spoken about the plans we've got in place for managing the summer economy, which I think are really robust and really good. So one for us just to keep an eye on and through the tasking process. Any questions on that so far? Are you happy for me to just keep whizzing through?
No, it might be as well not to break your flow.
Okay. So into the neighbourhood crime one then. Again, you'll see where we are in terms of increases in the last 12 months, but actually still significantly lower than we were pre-COVID. Again, that does pretty well reflect a lot of the national trends. So just again, not one to be overly concerned about, but what we do need to ensure is that we are identifying any trends as they happen. So again, through tasking, the fortnightly tasking process, making sure that we are identifying any trends and getting to them in order to iron out any peaks. But we are obviously it's something that we monitor routinely and manage on a daily basis. So I wasn't going to pull out anything else as an exception from that. I think this is the same slide because the data hasn't been updated. So this is the same slide actually I think we'd seen from the last one, the national rankings. which again shows that picture. So shows us as 13th. We were 12th previously, but 13th overall for recorded crime nationally, and shows us as being primarily first, second, some third quartile compared nationally, with others, and with shoplifting being that area that's in exception. And I know we did discuss that at the last meeting. Okay, just moving into the outcomes then. So this is an area that that we have seen, as you can see on the graphs, an increase in outcomes and an improvement in outcomes, but it isn't as yet where we want it to be overall. Now, again, I do predict that this will, we're putting a lot of investment in terms of supervision of investigations, in terms of the new structures that we've got in place to more effectively manage investigations, with the new model that came in earlier in the year. So I am confident with the plan that we've got in place that we are going to start seeing increased numbers of outcomes, and certainly as a percentage of the crime recorded, we're going to have increased outcomes because we're going to be recording less crime. So I think this is going to be on an upward trajectory, but you'll see already we've started to make those performance improvements. And that then correlates with the real reduction in antisocial behaviour. So really significant. We've done some sort of some detailed looking into this reduction in antisocial behaviour. We do think this is partially as a result, and I know on previous slides we've spoken about some of the really good problem solving work we've done with partners and in local areas through our neighbourhood policing teams. So I think there is a genuine reduction in antisocial behaviour, but I think this has also been as a result of some of our crime recording practices where we will also be priming lower level crimes, which then are closed as a crime incident rather than antisocial behaviour. So some of this reduction in ASB recorded, it correlates with some of the increases in the lower level crime, but not completely. So I think there is some good news in there for us. And then really just flagging the rural crime action team and what they've been dealing with. And I know the earlier slide spoke about the theft of lead from the church roof. I think this was, this is quite a small team. That was an investment through the uplift, as you well know. But I think that the results that we're getting from this team are really, really significant. And I think, this is just sort of on a slide sharing those results with you. So just looking at the difference in terms of incidents on the hair coursing, and that's where we've taken really proactive early measures in order to deal with people coming into the county, doing hair coursing and all of that associated difficulty that brings. And because of the fact that we've been able to respond to that in a really timely way, that we've been proactive in getting out into those locations and knowing who we're looking for, the fact that we've seized their dogs, 40 dogs seized, really, really significant impact in terms of calls for service. But also what I would hope, we can't claim this yet, but I would hope that would also come into an impact in terms of public confidence, in terms of us being able to police those rural communities within Lincolnshire, dealing with the things that matter to them, because it is a really tricky, we know that rural criminality is really tricky, and I think that's a massive success story. I think the other things that they've also been involved with, there's loads of other stuff that team, I know we've sort of focused in the hair coursing, but there's loads of other incidents that they deal with, and that where we've had some real success. They've had Op Kidderminster, which was a warrant where we've gone and whether the birds were being bred illegally for sale abroad. About 200 birds have been found, and it's about £300,000 worth, I think. Sorry, Chris, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. It's just the other part on this as well, because I know some people will raise the question about, why is rural crime so important? It's not just about the rural crime, it's about the damage to our communities and the threats that are made to them. But when you look at that incident volume as well, prior to the rural crime team being put in there, that was hundreds and hundreds of incidents that we were having to deploy neighbourhood officers or response officers to, that were just taking up inordinate amounts of time. So that demand reduction actually frees up time elsewhere to keep other communities safe and to make sure that we're using our resources effectively. And going back to that priority, as it says at the top of the slide, about stop crime and antisocial behaviour. The ultimate measure for policing is the absence of crime and antisocial behaviour. And that's exactly what this team is doing. And by doing that, it's freeing up time elsewhere for the limited resources that we have to make sure that we keep the whole of Lincolnshire safe.
Yeah, and so you know, huge impact. And whilst it's, you know, I know that the hair coursing is such a big impact in terms of the incidents and the ability to then put our resources elsewhere, but they're also that team have also been dealing with, you know, plant theft, cable theft, working with other forces cross border. There's some really good success stories there. So I just think it's you know, just worth flagging that, really, because for a fairly modest investment, that's what we've had from it, and certainly you know, something that we'd be really keen to sustain going forward. So sorry, let me move on. Moving into some of our protection from harm and vulnerability areas. So, I mean, I've already spoken about some of the domestic abuse and the increased reports of domestic abuse, which I think, you know, we have to see as a confidence thing, as a good, much as we want to protect victims of domestic abuse, the fact that people are reporting it is a good thing. And then you'll see those comparisons in terms of rape offences and the increases around that. Again, a lot of that would say is a good thing in terms of people being confident to report it. The last year has been pretty static, so whether we've sort of hit a bit of a plateau in terms of those reports. But what we are doing, as you know, is working really closely, and this again in the coming year will be an area of real focus from a investigative point of view, a prevention point of view, and a partnership point of view around violence against women and girls. How can we give people better confidence? How can we protect people? How do we make sure that we're really dealing robustly with perpetrators? So a lot of the stuff that's coming from the National Violence Against Women and Girls and Opposite Area, which, as you know, is the model that is being proposed for policing, with a set of principles and pillars, which we are signed up to deliver, and in any event are delivering already, but making sure we're pulling from that best practice, and not feeling, you know, I suppose it's how you look at some of these figures and look at the fact that not being scared about an increase in some of this reporting, that actually a lot of that is around people coming forward and being prepared to report in ways that perhaps they didn't do previously. So that's the from that side of the house. And then moving on, coming into the last couple of slides, so mental health. So this is an area where I think from a partnership point of view as well, we know we've got lots of work to do in this coming year. So you'll be aware Humberside was sort of piloted the right care, right person, or first started this right care, right person model. It's not just about mental health, it's about other people with caring, with concern for welfare. And, you know, the vast majority of our calls for service, or a high proportion of our calls for service, are about concern for safety in general, not just mental health, but concern for safety. In relation to the mental health, so specifically the right care, right person, us working up now with our partners, how we will implement. So there's the national programme that's rolling out, which Chris Davison, the ACC, is leading for us here locally, but it's looking at how can we implement those proposals, but do it in a way where we're not leaving a great big gap for vulnerable people. But really, you know, driving those forward so that we can start to reduce some of this. And it has actually, we have seen reductions. If you look at the mental health incidents, we have seen reductions from its peak. So they are coming down, but we do still need to get them down further, and to make sure that appropriate agencies are dealing. So I am, as you know, a member of the both the Health and Wellbeing Board and the Integrated Care Board, and I've already started having conversations at that executive level, saying this is coming, and we just need to work, you know, towards making sure that we've got proper, robust plans in place. And so I expect to see ongoing reductions. I don't see this going back to nothing. I think just one of the things that's quite sort of we do need to understand is that dealing with people who are in mental health crisis is sometimes an appropriate thing for the police to do. You know, so we're not going to stop dealing with people who have got who are in mental health crisis. What we need to do is just to make sure that we're not dealing with people who otherwise could be being picked up by the other agencies who are better placed, better resourced to deal with them at that moment. So a downward trajectory, I think, for this, and this is one that obviously we're you know, very keen to see you know, work developing over the coming months. And then moving on to towards the end of the report, then protecting from harm. So just in terms of, and I know the Chief spoke about, we had a really tragic, I mean, all fatals are tragic, particularly tragic one at the weekend. Again, the overall trajectory of the year has been a reduction in terms of KSI killed or seriously injured on our road. You know, we are doing significant amount of enforcement. So again, this was an area of investment under the uplift, which does lead to our roads policing teams going and doing lots of enforcement. And we would, and in those areas where we know that we've got you know, the hotspot areas where we've got more risky areas on our road, which, as you'll see, you know, we have got significant reductions in terms of KSI. So hoping that the summer months and people out on the motorbikes and other areas of risky driving, that we can maintain that going forward. But again, I think it's a success story, much as in the current context, a real tragic incident over the weekend and in recent weeks. Moving on to sort of the sort of conclusion then, responding to the public in terms of 999. So we know that the call level continues to increase, you know, and some of that is down to silent 999s, so where phones and things are making calls by accident, and some of it is actual calls for service, and some of it, a lot of it is concern for safety type calls for service. So we've got this ongoing increase in terms of 999. Again, that is reflected nationally. Then we have the performance in terms of answering the nines, I think, remains strong. But as already sort of spoken about, we've then, well, in fact, we'll come on to the 101. But you know, strong performance around answering the nines. It's the area that we prioritise, and we always will do. So good sort of story there, but we do know that then does impact into the non-emergency demand, where actually incident volumes have reduced over time in terms of the actual number of volumes we get on the 101. But obviously we get more than just 101. We're also getting stuff coming in through the single online home. So we continue, you know, we've made the investment into the contact centre. These people are still being trained. We're doing all we can to retain them and ensure that we're not losing people. So we've done that sort of mapping across in terms of salary and ensuring that we're paying people a good amount of money. But basically those resources that we've recruited are still in training and still to come. So not as yet seen, the uplift in that performance that we want to see, but reassured that actually the right care, right person work alongside this uplift in resources will start to deliver that. But I suspect we might need to get over the bulk of the summer demand before we start seeing any real improvements. And then moving on, just I think this is the last slide, got another slide to go after this one, but this is really about the response times, and just really this is the urgent response. We are going to do the same for priority response as well. Just to be able to show that to you, but overall, just looking at when are we meeting our urgent response times within the timescales that we set ourselves. So for urban, we're getting 60% within 15 minutes and just short of 90% in 30 minutes, with an average attendance time of 21 minutes. Rural, we're getting to 2/3 within the 20-minute target, 85 within 30 minutes, with an average of 22.29 minutes. So whilst that's not quite, you know, we're not hitting it 100% of the time, actually I think that's quite strong performance when you bear in mind the geography of the county and the limited resources that we have on each of our shift, I think that's actually really quite strong performance in terms of what we're getting to and at what times. And then moving on, the last one, user satisfaction. So we've got a lot of work being undertaken just to make sure that people are complying with VCOP. I think, again, the changes to the Home Office counting rules may assist some of this, because officers won't have quite so many crime reports to be juggling in order to meet their in order to make sure that they are updating victims and doing those real basic things that we know does really contribute towards satisfaction. So we're seeing a slight increase in terms of satisfaction. Need to keep driving it up in that same further than that 1%. With all of the work that we're doing around investigation standards and supervision, I'm confident that we'll continue to see more of an uplift there. And I think that's taken us to the end. So sorry, I know I've gone through that in a little bit of detail, but I thought it just putting out the highlights as we went might be helpful.
No, thank you very much for that. I think it is sort of easier to, rather than me sort of try and interrupt and break your flow, it's easier for you to cover all the ground that you want to cover, really, I think. I've got a number of questions. I've been making some notes as we've gone along. So just looking at the area around stalking and harassment, that's close to the upper tolerance limit. We know that is one area that's been affected by the way crime is recorded. But it'd be interesting to understand your perspective of why stalking and harassment is where it is, and what action is being taken by the force to tackle those kinds of crime. We know that obviously they can affect people for the long term. It's one of those crime types that can last for a very long time. It's not sort of something that happens and then everything gets back to normal. So it'd be useful to understand what's being done to tackle that. I know there are orders that can be used. How effectively do you think we're tackling that?
Okay, so stalking and harassment, we are and we have seen that increase, and it is getting up towards the top of tolerance, where but some of that is, I think, to be honest, where we've done an awful lot of training for people. So we've done the DA Matters training, where people are more sort of aware of what stalking harassment is, and also then we're doing the compliance checks in the background to make sure that we are recording it where it does need to be recorded. So we do know, I mean, just in terms of not necessarily reassurance, but most of these stalking harassments are people who are known, the person who is the offender is known to the victim. So this isn't kind of, unknown person stalking me in my home. It is a high percentage are domestic related, which, as we know, can be some of the most dangerous ones. So it's really good that we are identifying these because they can be some of the most dangerous offenders when they're the domestic related ones and who are, these are the course of conduct offences. So those ones that aren't domestic or where they're not known, most of those we've had a really good sort of deep dive into this, and most of them are, or a high proportion of them are, where some of them can be where people owe each other money, where people, so somebody makes a threat or a number of threats because they're trying to recover debt. So they're the sorts of things that are being done with crimes committed through stalking harassment. Going forward with the new counting rules, we'll be able to see these really clearly, because we'll be able to, the course of conduct offence is the one that we'll be recording, and it'll be really clear the picture that we can build up. But just going into, and I know the chief wants to come in, but just going into the use of orders, this was picked up probably over 12 months ago now, about are we using orders effectively, and we've seen a significant increase in how we're applying for domestic violence protection orders. So obviously we do the DVPM, which then goes to court and then gets translated into an order. So the training and effort that we put in there has seen a significant increase in the numbers of those orders that we put in place through our superintendents and that are now going to court. So certainly through the performance meeting, we're tracking and monitoring that. And I am happy that we are increasing and that we are really dealing with people and trying to get into those perpetrators. If we can't charge them with offences, that we're looking at the use of those ancillary orders in a really effective way. And you'll know, or you may not be aware, that we've now moved the ancillary orders unit. So this, in Lincolnshire, we have a specific unit set up to deal with those ancillary orders, which other forces don't have. So we've sort of invested in that, and we've put that into our sort of safeguarding, into our protecting vulnerable people crime command, to make sure that that is really as joined up as it possibly can be.
Thank
Chris,
you.
sorry, Chief.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And I ought to highlight the work that Julia has done on this in moving all of this forward, and particularly around those ancillary orders piece. The observation I was going to make here is that the stalking and harassment piece, as Julia said, is the secondary kind of course of conduct issue. And the difficulty we have with this from a public confidence point of view is, as soon as the word stalking is in there, it's quite an emotive term and creates fear. Actually, it's stalking and harassment, so there is a broad definition of this, and in the vast majority of cases what we're looking at is that ongoing harassment particularly around the domestic issues that Julie has already referenced, where there are threats and harassment around money and access to children or whatever it might be. So that course of conduct is quite a broad definition. I think we just need to be careful about the word stalking, which is the piece that creates the fear in the public mind, and keeping that in perspective. Whilst it's important that we capture that and that we deal with it, we need to bear in mind that this is a really broad range and a broad definition. And one of the things we do know, and why some of the crime recording standards are going to be changed, which we'll talk about later on the agenda, is that we now know that we are over recording those compared to the Crime Survey of England and Wales. And I think some of that has been about our training, about the requirements that we've had, the set of rules and how complicated they are. And it's now just about rebalancing some of that and making sure that we've got that accurately.
No, thank you for that. I suppose a couple of things I'll look at, and I agree with the fact that really it's almost a collective sort of term when we say stalking and harassment, which covers a number of different things, and it's not to belittle any one of them, but they are different things that are being put together. I suppose if we look at the stalking piece directly, I suppose the question is, do we feel confident that those ones that you rightly say are probably the ones that spread the fear in the public mind, that where it's somebody that's actually proactively trying to intervene in their life, who's maybe not in a domestic situation? Are we confident that we've got the processes and procedures right, that we're using the orders as we can do in those circumstances? And in particular, the other thing I would just add to that, I know the PCC down in Sussex, sort of who's been a victim of these kinds of crimes herself, has sort of led a lot on some of the changes that we've seen nationally, and in particular she did commission HMIC FRS to look at her force directly just in this area. I wonder whether if it would be useful to recirculate at some point that report, because I just think, as you've said, there's a lot of work going on locally on this, and I think there was quite a bit of learning in that. It's obviously not directly about Lincolnshire, but I think the principles are probably useful to just check.
Commissioner, I wouldn't argue with that at all. I think that's to recirculate the report, probably be a useful reminder to those working in this field. And you're right, actually, the critical part is picking up those points of stalking and harassment where we have got that very deliberate action, because there's a lot of risk that we have to manage within that domestic environment, or where people are known to each other. But the other part to this is actually, are we picking up where we've got strangers who are stalking and harassing people for whatever their motivation might be, and managing that risk as well. And that's the balance that we need to find in all of this work.
Excellent. The other thing which sort of connects to that, but also leads into other areas of work, you mentioned obviously about the training, Julia, that had obviously been provided, which is great. The other area which I know training has been invested, but only in a fairly limited way so far, is around trauma-informed training. And I know some forces have rolled out trauma-informed training as a wider piece, and I just wondered if that was something Lincolnshire had considered, whether it's something we might consider into the future, and just what your thoughts are really on that.
Well, it's an interesting one because I mean the training that I would say that some of our training that we've done will pick up some of the trauma informed elements within it, but we haven't labelled it as trauma informed. So the DA mattered stuff, I think some of that will have a trauma informed approach, but yeah, we've not reviewed. I mean, I know within the region, other forces have had much more of a bespoke sort of trauma informed and partnership training element. So it's certainly something we can consider reviewing. I mean, we've had such a large investment in through the DA training, and then through with our officers in terms of all of the child abuse investigations and rape training. The only consideration about them putting something more bespoke on that isn't incorporated within those is the abstraction from their day job, which is obviously just takes us away from being able to do that operational piece. But certainly something that we can go and have a look at and say, is there, do we think we've got enough of that trauma informed approach within? Because my understanding of the trauma informed approach is that it's all about getting into that very the very early sort of intervention work and understanding adverse childhood experiences and that sort of stuff, which a lot of that will be involved already in some of those specific courses that we do.
I mean, I know, for example, Hampshire have now rolled it out to several hundred of their officers, and I'm sure they will be evaluating that. So I mentioned that purely because there might be some interesting information there about the value that it's provided, which might inform whether it's of good value for us to consider here in Lincolnshire. Jo.
Yeah, just for information in terms of local work on this, through the Women's Strategy and Concordat, one of the areas that we've looked at is trauma-informed training and women's-centred training as well. So we're currently working with the Safeguarding Adults Board and Safeguarding Children's Partnership training provision arm to look at, there isn't specifically any dedicated training around trauma-informed training. It is inbuilt to some of their existing training, such as domestic abuse training, as Julia just said. But they're looking at whether they could develop some specific training, which would obviously be accessible to the force as one of the key partners on the boards at no cost, accepting Julia's point that abstraction will still be needed.
Excellent. There were a couple of questions that came up on Friday when I attended the police and crime panel. They were more operational questions than they were probably in my area, but I obviously approached it from a police and crime commissioner angle rather than a policing directly angle. So I just thought it'd be useful to get your take on them. In particular, there were questions where they'd requested some information around the residential burglary figures and a 4% clear up rate, and the direct question was asked of me, did I think 4% was good enough for the people of Lincolnshire? And I hope I was able to give some context around what that meant in the round. But one of the other questions that came up was something that I have asked previously, and I don't think I've, to be fair, asked it of this leadership team, and I think it's an important one to ask, which is around the use of forensics, both with burglary, but also in the general sense, as to whether we feel we get the use of this right from a volume point of view. We know there's a cost implication to the use of forensics, but consistently we've been very efficient with our use of forensics when you look at it against regional colleagues' performance. And I just wonder if that's something that is reviewed, is looked at. Have we got some assurance that we're using forensics where appropriate, not overusing it, not underusing it? So what I wouldn't want is a key tactic that you obviously want to use to be in any way restricted because of a financial or a perception of a financial control, if it's something that we need to use more of.
So, Commissioner, in relation to the two questions, so I'll start with the burglary, but on the outcomes, I'll probably defer that to Julia because she chairs the performance meeting. But going back to what I said a few minutes ago, is the focus is very much on reducing and preventing and driving down the incidence of burglary, residential burglary. And arresting people and locking them up is part of that. And there are a range of formal and informal outcomes that need to be measured in terms of having success there, part of which is about locking people up, part of it is about rehabilitation, and part of it is about preventing people from reoffending. But just a reminder to people that if you look at pre-COVID levels for residential burglary to today, we're 22% down on where we were against what we would consider to be the normal measures. So there's some positive news there, and we need to keep focused on that, because actually the true measure of policing should be the absence of crime. How we react to that and how quickly we react to that is important, but obviously if we're reacting to it and locking people up, then the burglary has happened. So that's the first point. Excuse me. In relation to forensics, there's a lot of science goes into this, as you'd expect, and an awful lot of analysis about what will have a positive impact and what type of forensic examination will lead to positive outcomes. And that very much drives how much we submit from crime type to crime type, and the nature of those samples. And within the budget that we have available to it, I think we get pretty good value from our colleagues at East Midlands Special Ops Forensic Services and our own CSIs, and we do focus our attention on those areas where we are likely to get the most positive outcomes from it. What the data will show is if you load that up even further with yet more samples, you are very unlikely to see any increase in your positive outcome rate. You will just increase your cost and swamp the system because you're not actually putting the right samples in for the right reasons. And we know how fragile that forensic marketplace is at the moment. So adding volume to it actually presents risk without actually bringing any real benefit to us.
Thank you for that. So I suppose in short, what you're saying is you are satisfied that we're broadly getting that balance right, which is good to hear. You mentioned, Julia, around in particular neighbourhood crime, but ASB, where problem solving approaches. It'd be useful if you can give me an example or two of what you mean by that, because it's sort of it's you know, it can mean any number of things, but what kind of approaches do you think have led to some of the reductions that we've seen?
Yeah, so it's really where we've got, as you know, we are committed with our neighbourhood policing teams in every neighbourhood across the force, and where we have a particular issue that comes up, where we work the problem solving approaches, where we have the SARA model, which is where you scan, analyse, respond and then assess. So that's just a kind of model that our police officers are trained to work through. But they do that with partners, and they do that with the relevant partners in those localities, and engage with those whoever are those, if it's we've had some really good examples actually of working with mental health partners, where we've had demand created by individuals who have got mental health needs, and where we've engaged at that neighbourhood level through our neighbourhood policing teams with mental health practitioners and come up with a problem solving. So basically, what's the problem? Do we actually understand it? What's going to be options for us to address it, and how can we do it collectively? Where very often it won't be a taking people to court through coercive police action. It will be by perhaps providing some additional support, additional services elsewhere. So it's those sorts of approaches that we train our neighbourhood teams to deliver with the the relevant agencies locally. Now, and so I think there was a recent example in the Towers area in Lincoln, where there'd been an awful lot of incidents of antisocial behaviour created, lots of community concerns, lots of elderly people who were concerned about some of the activity of young people, and so the approach that was taken was both kind of trying to divert people, so working with local authority, looking at ways we might be able to divert people, but actually giving people the kind of acceptable behaviour contract type things, the letters as well. So it's that kind of approach to try to get to the root of the problem, rather than that there's not you know, we're much better, generally speaking, if we can get to the root of the problem and deal with that rather than try to enforce our way out of it.
Yeah, and I'd have to say I saw something on the force's social media. I think it was the Highcombe Sleaford account in particular, where they, without naming anybody inappropriately, they talked about the fact that there'd been some reports of antisocial behaviour, particularly with a younger cohort of residents around Heckington, and actually they'd proactively been to visit, you know, the homes of those individuals and speak to the parents. And I suppose it's the kind of policing that the public sort of thinks has stopped, and that, you know, it doesn't meet the threshold for the police to be involved anymore. And I think it's really important that where those examples exist, that we are highlighting them in the way that happened there, because I think I often will get comments from the public about how the police just aren't that interested, or haven't got time to be interested, probably more correctly, in some of those kind of concerns in local communities, where actually what we're seeing is Lincolnshire Police go and be proactive in those spaces to try and keep people on the right path, if you like, to prevent any escalation in negative behaviours, which would lead to them needing to ultimately go through the criminal justice system. So I think those kind of examples, I applaud the fact that the force is not just doing it, but also making sure that the community is aware that they're doing it. And I think if that was replicated around the county, then that would certainly help the public, you know, feel that you were obviously on their side in the way that you are on their side. You mentioned, moving on, about particularly with sexual crimes in particular, and domestic abuse, that quite often, you know, certainly the general feeling is when reports go up, that often can be hand in hand with an increase in confidence to report, or indeed additional mechanisms have been put in place to enable people to report that maybe wouldn't have come through the existing routes. I suppose the one question is, do we think anything has changed as to why that might have led to an increase? How are we doing something different? Are partners doing something different? We know that we've had investments in specialist roles in these spaces, so whether that's had an impact, so having people working in hospitals, for example, with victims of domestic abuse, may have led to some increases. But I suppose the other question to that is, do we think that will lead to an increase in positive outcomes? Because if we're having an increase in reportings, that's obviously the input, but at the other end, do we think that will lead to, you know, an equal reaction at the other end?
So in terms of the input, I don't think we can attribute it to any particular intervention that's in place. I think we do know that we are that we do record things very, very accurately. So in the high 90s% of anything that gets reported to us that should be recorded, we do know that we are recording that, and that compliance has probably improved in the last few years. So that might account for some of it. But I do think that there is also the confidence issue of people coming forward, and that generally, you know, over sort of post-COVID, the violence against women and girls agenda nationally, the whole profile of reporting domestic abuse and sexual offences, you know, that this is a national thing that you know that we applaud, and we're pleased to see, you know, people feeling that they can come forward and report offences. But I don't think that there's anything, Commissioner, that we can attribute that to in terms of, you know, in a definitive way, I've got to say. In terms of outcomes, no, I'm not sure that it will lead to more outcomes, and I'd like to think that it would. I don't think, because some of the complexity of this is that people will report a domestic abuse and will then report a sexual offence that might have taken place 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 3 years ago, and that can be quite challenging to say, well, we're therefore going to get a positive outcome for that. You know, now it's not saying that we can't get a positive outcome, because we might have all sorts of
all sorts of corroborative evidence from the time. But I think saying that there's going to be more reporting is going to lead to more positive outcomes, I think is possibly, I don't think we could say that. I think what we need to do is to make sure that when people are reporting, that we give them all of the support that they need to stay confident in the process, so that they don't then withdraw from a criminal justice process. And I think that's the big work for us to be doing with our partners, is about giving people the confidence to stay in a process once they've started in it, making sure that we are being really robust with offenders, which I think we are, but also working with our partners within the wider criminal justice system to try to get, you know, to try to make that as timely and easier process for people to go through, because frankly it's really quite challenging, and this is the whole work for Oxfordshire, you know, and with partners is, you know, some of these offences are really quite challenging to get the evidence for in the first case, but also then that the experience, you know, we need to make that for the experience of the victim as user friendly as we possibly can do, and I think that's the piece of work for us to.
No, thank you very much for that. I think it's an important point to just raise that you know, just because we're getting more reports, there are complexities as to why. It doesn't necessarily mean that there will be an equal and opposite reaction on the other side. It's not that you don't want that outcome, but it's not always sort of straightforward. So a couple of points I just wanted to make, really, based on what you'd said. One was around the rural crime team, who it's clear to see from the statistics they've had a huge impact on the areas of rural crime, which we always thought, you know, that would be the case. And I think the fact that other forces with rural crime teams now have a Lincolnshire rural crime team to interact with is also going to help with that cross-border criminality as well, which I think is really important. And you know, we certainly hope that they will go from strength to strength. And obviously, from my point of view, from an investment perspective, it's just making sure that all of your teams obviously have the right training, equipment, everything else. But with new units, I guess it's one of those things that will be reviewed as you go through things. And if there are additional requirements, then obviously we want to make sure that they've got the right tools to do the job, which is one of the stated aims in our police and crime plan. So if as time goes forward, there's more we need to do there to arm them with the right things to have the most impact, then I'm sure that those are discussions we will have. And the same with the roads policing unit. We know how important it is to have that visible presence on the road, both from a behaviour change point of view, which ultimately will lead to people hopefully driving in a manner which means that incidents won't occur in the first place, but also in that deterring criminality point of view as well. So I think that is important. The other thing I would note on that is that a lot of the people that use our roads don't necessarily know them as well as Lincolnshire residents. A lot of people travel to Lincolnshire for leisure and pleasure, whether it's in summer and motorbikes, whether it's just to the East Coast, whatever it is. And so we're determined to work with colleagues, PCCs and road safety partnerships around the area to improve people's awareness of how best to go and enjoy our road network and get home safely again. And to that end, it's just really to make a note that there will be on the 15th of September a second road safety summit. We held one back in November of 2017, but this one will be much bigger and more joined up approach, where we will be joining up with other force areas to try and make sure that we're looking at best practice, look at some of the real improvements Lincolnshire have made across the partnership, and obviously look to strive to reduce tragedy even further on our roads. Chief, you wanted to come in?
It's just to emphasise the point you're making, Commissioner, is the results from the road safety partnership and the road policing team are quite staggering, and I hope that we can sustain this, because when I first arrived as chief, I said that the deaths that we have on our roads in Lincolnshire are too high, and if this was our murder rate, we'd probably put all of our resources into it until it came down to something that was a bit more balanced. And if you look at those pre-COVID baselines, to say we've had like 39 fewer deaths on our roads, so nearly 60% reduction in the past 12 months compared to the COVID baseline or pre-COVID baseline, I think it's a staggering effort. And likewise, 13% drop in seriously injured accidents as well. You know, this is exactly what policing is here for, is to protect people from harm and to protect life, and that's the results that they're showing. So I just think it's quite staggering the work they're doing, and I hope that we can sustain that through the summer period and keep that education and enforcement piece working.
I fully support exactly what you're saying there, and obviously the most worrying cohort, I often think, and there's never one cohort on the roads that ultimately won't have any issues, but certainly we have a high percentage of incidents involving motorcycles, and working with them to make sure that they're able to use our roads safely is something that's obviously of huge importance. And that's why I think having a regional approach to some of the things we've really pushed forward on with education programs and other things, to make sure that, you know, if we get motorcyclists that are coming from Leicestershire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Norfolk, wherever it happens to be, they equally are going to get that joined up approach from their road safety partnerships to really push forward on the lessons that we're already very aware of. So hopefully that will be our able to take our learning and share that. It's not suggesting that everybody isn't doing a good hard job, but because of the length of our road network and the amount of B and C roads that we have, I think we've had to do a significant amount there at the partnership level. So hopefully that'll be of value to others. Another question I'd got was around neighbourhood crimes generally. I know this has been an area where the force is obviously aware that there's some work to do in this space. I know obviously that a new neighbourhood policing model is being rolled out, and it's really, I think we've at the next accountability meeting, it'd be useful to go into a bit of a deeper dive on what that model is, what your view is on how that's all going to come together, and what your sort of ambition for that area of business. So it was just really to get that request in there, if that's okay. And I've got a question around the public contact. I mean, we know that the 101 contact has been going down. We know that resources in there post taking over the control room directly from G4S. Obviously, there's been a transition, and putting additional resources in there takes time. Fully accept that. The area that I'm interested in is around the single online home, because one of the things that I do get asked is, well, if I send something in, what happens to it, and over what time frame am I going to get somebody contact me? So how is this a priority over if I call 101? So if you could explain for me what the public can expect if they use the online reporting process, that would be really helpful.
Okay, well, and so that will depend slightly on what they're using it for, because obviously that single online home, you could report, you know, there's lots of different things that you can send messages for. So you can send a complaint, you can send a letter of thanks, you can ask for disclosure around, you know, Clare's Law, the domestic abuse disclosure. So there's a number of different things, and I think it's a really fair point, to be honest, about how you know, how explicit are we with the public about what they can expect. If they're reporting a crime, or if they're reporting an incident, then they should expect the same as we would if we were reporting it. The difficulty or the difference is that they're just not going to get somebody answering a phone. They're reporting it online, which is obviously you know, in the title, but that will come in. So if it's a crime, it will come in, it will be registered, it will then be allocated out, if appropriate, for ongoing investigation. So they will go through a triage process. So, and just to be clear, the single online home, so this is a national system, and the benefit of the system is it's meant to bring consistency, so that wherever you're reporting this, you get the same experience for those forces. I'm not sure how many forces now are signed up to it, but you get the same experience. So here, if you're reporting a crime, it will come in and it will be assessed. You'll go through a triage that will say if it's an emergency, you need to phone us instead, don't report it online. And then that will come in and that will be assessed and then allocated out to the local policing area, or an assessment will be made. Is it going into our investigative team, our CID, who needs to actually respond to that? And that's the way, and then contact will be made with that member of the public. Now, perhaps, you know, I think it's a fair challenge just in terms of the timeliness and the timescales that people, you know, whether we're explicit enough with the timescales at which we will respond, and that's perhaps just something that we could do some more communication around. If it's an incident, again, they'll go in. So if you can report ASB online, antisocial behaviour online, and you'll get and it will go through a similar route, but will go into the neighbourhood policing teams, where again you should get a contact.
Yeah, I mean that's really helpful, because I think it isn't. I think the fact that we use this jargon of single online home, it doesn't mean anything to the public, but policing as a national thing has adopted this term. It means a website, really. So I know it's a national standardised process, but from the public contacting Lincolnshire Police, it's contacting through the website, and I think it's a really useful thing. I've spoken to lots of people who have said they found it of huge value. You know, they you know, if it's something that's not urgent, it's not a crime in action, it's something they want to give us information about, it maybe has happened the day before or whatever, and they can do it at their leisure without having to call through 101. They found it really helpful, and I think it will become a greater tool as time goes by. But I think having some kind of information we can share with the public about how well used it is and how quickly things get responded to in comparison, so that people can be assured that if they use that instead of 101, it's a comparable process. I think that would be useful. So that's maybe something for us to look at. Okay, there wasn't anything else I was going to cover off as part of this section, so I think we'll move on unless anybody's got anything else they wish to say. I've got a hand up in the OPCC conference room. I'm not sure that's Aubrey or Joe.
It's me, thanks, Mark. It was just a quick one. Trust and confidence, Julia, you mentioned that the force have introduced that single question, and it was an issue that came up repeatedly at the panel on Friday. I've seen that there's been a really great response from the public in answering that question. I just thought it might be helpful to explain how the force are using the responses to that question.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So I think we're fairly early days really in terms of having the responses come in, and actually the last time that I'd seen some of those responses, we were sent, and so Di Coulson is the ACC who's leading this work for us, and that we'd wanted to see more responses so that we'd got more data that we could actually then act on in terms of that confidence. So I mean, what we will be doing with it is understanding, well, what are people saying, why are they saying it, do we know where they're saying it, so that we can then, and it's a baseline, so in terms of this coming year, it's a baseline for us to then build upon, to understand, right, well, what do we need to be doing differently, and where, or understanding what is, you know, what is driving public confidence. So that's the whole purpose for it, is so that we can understand that. But as yet, we're still early enough days that we didn't have the full, you know, we didn't have the enough of that data to make any sort of decisions about the so what.
Thank you. I just think it's really helpful for anyone who's answered the question already to know that you wait until you've got a kind of more body of evidence before you act on it. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for that, Joe. Okay, so moving on from there, we'll move on to our next topic for discussion, which is the force peel inspection. So this is the recent inspection that was carried out by HMIC FRS. So over to you to go through. I know you've obviously completed a report. I suppose my headline question around that, I mean, I think there was a number of things that it's fair to say the force were not necessarily in agreement, that the view was necessarily a fair reflection of where it currently is or where it's going, but it would be useful to hear both, you know, for what you think is going well, what you think is maybe more of a challenge, and anything you sort of disagree with in there. Okay,
thanks, Commissioner. If I start on this one, and I'll let Julia come in as we go through. There's the report that's been submitted with us around our response to the PL inspection. So if I just canter through that quickly, and within that I'll probably touch on some of the stuff that we think is going well. I think you summed it up quite nicely. We were disappointed with the way the report was written. The focus that seemed to be on elements that maybe weren't as strong as they could be, but neglected to highlight the bits of work that we were doing well, particularly around some of our rape and sex offence investigations and the timely manner in which we were doing that, the way that we were inspecting those, and a failure to recognise the difficulties that we have in resourcing to double crew when we're visiting sex offenders and taking account of those difficulties, none of which actually made any difference to our performance, but because they didn't follow authorised professional practice, which is for me to determine and have a clear rationale as to whether we do or don't. Because it didn't follow APP, we ended up with some negative ratings. So that's just one example where we felt we were hard done by, because it wasn't the performance of the force, it was simply moving away from authorised professional practice, which we've done very deliberately, that led to a more negative rating than we would expect. But in terms of some of the findings that came in, we are working through these. So whilst we're disappointed, we're not ignoring them. We are going to work very closely with HMIC to make sure we respond to the areas for improvement. And the introduction just says how it's all set out. You can see there at point 2.2, we were disappointed about where we came out with our 999 response handling, because we've consistently been in the top 3 or 4 forces in the country around this, and responding to that higher volume of demand that Julia mentioned as we went through the performance dashboard. Nevertheless, we are still investing heavily in our call handlers. We do some really good work in there, and I do think it's an area that we handle very, very well, particularly that emergency side of things and looking after our victims and those people who are calling for our help. But because of the 101 piece, we were already recruiting call handlers into there, which wasn't reflected in the report, and the recognition that we needed to do more. And then from a crime recording point of view, we had remained relatively static at 90% compliance, and there's obviously new counting rules coming in, and in comparison to other forces, we were probably about where most forces were, albeit some issues around some of the secondary violence elements that haven't been recorded. So again, this data was taken at a point where we were still going through some significant training for our staff and officers, and some of that wasn't really reflected within their findings. It was taken on a purely data driven rather than the effort the force was going through to train people and make sure that we knew what the counting rules were and we were improving upon that. Crime and antisocial behaviour piece, we've made some improvements there, particularly around our problem solving and proactive approach, but the inspection team also highlighted that we were sending the right staff to incidents, that crimes are being allocated appropriately in nearly all cases, and that in the cases reviewed, arrests were made in an appropriate time frame and at the earliest opportunity. But we still seem to come out on the lower end of their assessments within that, despite those findings. And we felt that was probably a little unfair and not the most balanced report. And similar when we came to managing offenders and how we were dealing with that. But what they did recognise in each of these was the capacity and capability to deal with the volume of demand coming through, which goes to the heart of our financial issues. In terms of prioritising, we've spoken throughout this about prioritising our resources, Rose Policing Unit, Rural Crime Team, Also making sure that we use our officers effectively and we use our cash effectively. And not only have we put into road policing unit and rural crime team, but we've put 47 officers into response, 5 sergeants into response, 13 extra community beat managers, so police officers in there, as well as our road policing unit and rural crime team, all aimed at being proactive within our communities and driving down demand, and we're seeing the results of that coming through. I think where we struggled with the inspectorate was they came in at a time and looked at data that was a little bit about 6 months behind the dates that they came in, and that the results of some of these teams hadn't yet landed in terms of the data that we've been looking at today. And therefore, whilst the HMRC team said in the hot debrief that they saw the green shoots and they could see the journey that we were on, they were unable to give us higher gradings because the data wasn't matching up to that, and some of the impacts had yet to land. I think we're now in a position where we can probably demonstrate that as we've discussed through today. And in terms of protecting vulnerable people, we weren't disputing that. We know that's an area of concern for us, and it is one of the areas that we're investing in at the moment with additional money and resources. And the piece around managing demand we dispute because we've done a significant piece of work with an external consultancy, looking at our shift patterns, looking at the nature of the demand coming in, looking at the resources required, and we probably sit in a better position than we ever have been in terms of understanding that holistic demand. There is still some additional work to do around our crime demand and investigative demand coming through, and that's something that I'll be looking to do this year. But the work that we had done within the previous year wasn't necessarily reflected within the report. Again, because whilst the report had been done and we understood our demand, we were still in the process of putting in a new crime investigation model, a new investigative policy, new shift patterns, which involved changing people around to meet the demand better, and introducing a new response investigation team to support the lower level crime investigation. So again, I think from an HMIC perspective, their view would be as well, we can see what you're doing, but actually you haven't delivered the results yet, and therefore the gradings always stay at the lower end. We would hope if they came back now that it would be very different, but obviously still very hard to kind of accept that the work we were doing, whilst recognised in the hot debrief, was not picked up on and highlighted in the overall report. And the final bit I'll say on there is the piece I think that should have been given more recognition amongst others. One thing we haven't touched on here was around governance of the organisation. It came at a time where new deputy coming in, Julia was just arriving. We were changing our performance monitoring and performance board structures. So there was actually a bit of a delay in that happening. But at the same time, in terms of governance, we've just come through the G4S transition in a very, very short period of time with ultimately with very good outcomes and minimal disruption to the organisation. But that governance wasn't recognised and that control of where we were going with the force. And the work that ACC Chris Davison has been doing around culture and making sure that we have the highest standards in the organisation, that we're tackling those behaviours that you might see in the press around poor behaviours, misogyny, sexism, racism, that we are tackling those. We're making this a safe place for our officers and staff to work, but also making sure we translate that into the service we provide, and that we uphold all the values that we swear to in our oath was not reflected in the way that we would have hoped. Again, you move on 6 months, 9 months, and suddenly Chris Davison is being asked to present the work we're doing around culture at national events. Metropolitan Police have been to see us, and Chris has been down to present to them to try and help with the challenges they have there. And he's spoken at a couple of other national events recently. So whilst HMIC may not have reflected on that in our report, it is being recognised nationally now, and people are coming to Lincolnshire's door to say, how do you do this? How have you driven that culture work? How are you pushing the standards? And I think if we were to be expected now, you would probably see a very different outcome to how you treat your staff and that fairness at work issue that is often reported on in the HMRC report. So there's lots and lots of good stuff going on. I understand where HMRC came from, that they wanted to see hard data-driven results, and they recognised in the hot debrief, as I say, the green shoots, as they called it. But I think the disappointing part was that not a lot of that was actually reflected in the report, and it seemed to focus on the negative elements rather than the journey we're going on, and really didn't reflect the very difficult financial and resource position we're in, and put our performance into the context of that funding envelope when compared against other forces. So lowest funded force in the country, lowest number of officers per 1,000 population, but top first and second quartile in most of our crime performance and crime reduction areas. So I think that's where we felt disappointed with it. So I can't see the team screen because I was reading from that report. So I'll pause there and let Julia come in with anything extra and then see if there's any questions.
So all I was going to add to that then is we've got, so I'm chairing a delivery group, basically a appeal delivery group. We've got 21 areas for improvement that we've picked up through that group. I'm chairing that. We had our first sort of follow-up meeting, so we'd allocated owners to go and develop against all of those areas, and you know, some of them not, you know, some of them total, none of them that we really disagree with. I mean, we might come back and make policy decisions that we're still going to have to carry on doing things the way that we do it, but there's, you know, it's to have that as a conscious decision if that is going to be the case. But other things, you know, they're talking about some of our contact handling and our non-emergency. Well, we know that, we know we're investing in that already. You know, that wasn't a surprise to us. So those 21 areas for improvement, I think for the next, I've just had the first of the sort of catch-up meetings. For the next one, there'll be a number of those that will go green that I'll say we've completed. And there's some that are amber, that are ongoing because they're going to take a little bit more time. You know, we need the investment in our protecting vulnerable people to actually land, which means that we've got to have the police officers who started, who aren't yet out on independent patrol, have got to be on independent patrol before we can release people into some of those higher risk areas. So all of this stuff, which actually isn't in response to the HMRC report, is what we were already doing. But all of those things, those 21 areas are all being progressed and will be delivered. You know, my plan is that we ensure that we've got proper oversight and scrutiny of delivery, so that we have as little, you know, we're expecting HMRC to come back in back end of next year, 2024, and that everything there has been resolved. Obviously, when they do come in next year, it will be a different set of questions that they ask. So in the meantime, we'll be preparing, making sure that we're ready for that as well. But, you know, at the end of the day, this is about, are we doing the very best we can be for the people of Lincolnshire to keep them safe? So, you know, not sort of, you know, we're not defensive around it at all, but I think that there are, you know, as I think the chief has already said, those questions around prioritisation of allocating resource, because as we know, you know, we can't do absolutely everything that we would like to. But in terms of governance, I think we've got that response there. People are allocated as owners, and I'm quite happy with the progress that we're making.
Thank you. I suppose a comment from me that I don't expect to comment on, but it's something I can say and you probably can't. The reality is, the frustration on behalf of me as the public representative is, quite often we get incredibly good senior leaders, and obviously by the nature of the fact that they've been in policing a significant amount of time to gain the knowledge and experience to make them good senior leaders, it means we don't necessarily keep them that long in the roles. It's just the irony of how that works. So quite often we get people who want to set a strategic direction, and they start a force turning the tank around, which often it will take time. And quite often what that means is these inspections are actually more of a look at the previous leadership's endeavours rather than the current leadership's endeavours. And obviously it would be great to have the current leadership team here into the future, so that the next HMIC full inspection is indeed a true reflection of your work and efforts, because I think it's fair to say that the last one that we had before the one that we've just had was some significant time ago, so there's been quite a gap, and that always makes it quite difficult, you know, because I'm aware of the journey that you're on and the different stages that you're going through. Not to take away from the fact there's always going to be areas for improvement, things that need investment, and it's always good to have somebody external come in who can shine a light onto certain things, or at least reaffirm to you that the areas you are investing in are the right ones, which I think is the case here. There's lots of places where HMIC have said, well, you should be doing work here, and you were able to say, well, we are, and demonstrate that. It's just unfortunate the way the reports are written very seldom reflects a comment that says we've highlighted this is a gap and we can see they're doing something about the gap. It literally just comments that, you know, about the past rather than the future, which I don't think is necessarily helpful. So with regard to the report, there's obviously some areas you are going to be more in agreement with than others. Are there any recommendations or AFIs that you don't think you want to see completed? Are there areas where you're just going to be saying, well, we just don't agree with that for Lincolnshire, that's not going to be our priority? Or do you envisage that all the recommendations as they stand will be progressed against?
Yeah, all of the recommendations will be progressed against it. There is an irony that that, you know, the Home Office counting rule. So some of the findings around some of the sort of CDI compliance, crime data integrity compliance, you know, that is now changing anyway because of the counting rules. But no, everything that is there as a recommendation will be progressed almost in its entirety. Now, there might be some things like the Chief spoke about in terms of sex offender visiting that we might have to still maintain. You know, we might have to step outside of some of the APP, but that will be done consciously as a conscious decision. But everything will be progressed. You know, there's nothing there that we sort of say no, we don't agree with in principle.
Okay, that's good to know. And again, I mean, the APP is obviously there to be a help and a guide, and obviously we have one operational leader of Lincolnshire Police. So ultimately, I look to the Chief here to make those decisions on behalf of the residents of Lincolnshire. As useful as the information is that comes from the College of Policing and from other quarters, ultimately the judge of whether we're keeping people as safe as they can be, it will come down to the judgment of the Chief and the leadership team, not whether a particular piece of APP is being followed to the letter, or whether somebody's putting a Lincolnshire interpretation on it based on the appropriate resource allocation. So from my point of view, you know, you have my total trust and confidence in the fact that you are putting Lincolnshire first in those decisions that you are making, and I would rather you did that than chased after 100% blind compliance with things because, you know, a one-size-fits-all approach says that is the best way. As long as there's good rationale behind it, it's absolutely appropriate. That's why we have independent leadership of forces, so that we get an appropriate localized prioritization. Is there anything anybody else wants to ask on this particular piece of work? Aubrey, Joe? No? Okay, I think the other piece that fits with this is obviously the HMIC report that went into EMSU, the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, which had some recommendations in there as well. And I guess it would be useful just to have a view from you on your thoughts on that report as well.
Yeah, Mark. So I think most of that has been covered in the recent meeting with chiefs. A lot of it really came down to some of the governance structures, the lack of a 3-year funding settlement and capital programme for EMSU, the disquiet that there had been previously in the East Midlands around the collaborative approach, shall we say. So the 5 chiefs met last week. I think it is a much more positive group in terms of collaborative approach, much clearer about what we want from MSU and the work that needs to go on. And we've moved from a position of demanding lots and lots of cuts out of there and stripping resources out to a position of a balanced approach to it, the same as we would take with the force, which is here's your funding envelope, tell me which bits are the priority, we will agree them with you, which bits need investment, which bits we could afford to run the risk with, or we would not afford to, but we would have to run the risk with. So Paul Gibson is now going away and looking at actually which areas might need further investment rather than a continuous reduction. So part of that would fall into the major crime team and serious and organised crime unit, because I think they're the bits that have probably been denuded to the point where they're a little lacking in resilience, shall we say. And then there was the uplift requirement, but I think it's fair to say that most of that report that came from HMRC really expressed concerns around the collaborative approach by the 5 chiefs in the region, and I think we've now moved beyond that point.
No, thank you very much for that. It's just useful to understand how that will change. I mean, we're obviously internally aware of how you know, a change in PCCs or in Chief Constables can affect a regional collaboration, both for good and bad. But there's an absolute commitment from all of the police and crime commissioners across the East Midlands, and I believe the chiefs, to make MSU go from strength to strength. So there isn't any ongoing concern, I don't believe, regarding people's willingness to see that be a huge success. Okay, moving on then to our next section, which is around the Home Office counting rules. We know that one of the things that ministers in the Home Office have said when they took over their roles was what is it that the policing system would benefit from ministers doing that only ministers can do? So where could they add value? And one of the areas that they were requested to look at was trying to reduce some of the bureaucratic burden around the industry that had grown up around crime recording, not to make sure that people weren't being protected as victims or that in some way to reduce the number of crimes on the books, but the fact that there was a growing concern that the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which should be a truer reflection of experiences of crime, that's a direct sort of communication with the public, was getting out of kilter significantly with police recorded crime, where police recorded crime, rather than being less than people's experience of crime, which some would think it maybe would be if people weren't reporting, the opposite was true, and that actually we were seeing a huge increase in the amount of police recorded crime, and that obviously needed looking at. So I was very pleased that ministers had agreed to look at that afresh, but it would be really useful to understand your take on how this will affect Lincolnshire.
Do you want me to cover that, Chris?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to start with, just by way of starting, it is really welcome the fact that, you know, there has been this willingness to move on how we record crime, because I think, as you've, you know, very deftly summed up, if I may say, but, you know, this isn't about us not having as many victims or about us leaving victims, you know, not catered for. This is about the, you know, the bureaucracy in the background of working out what we needed to record and what else we needed to record, and how many offences were, you know, I might get called to a neighbour dispute and having to record 4 or 5 offences as part of that. And almost actually, you know, the tolerance level for, well, you know, is this a threat to commit criminal damage or not? You know, that there's some of the, you know, some of this is quite subjective. So the changes that have been introduced are very, very welcome. I do think it's going to take some time for them to bed in. So I think that's the note of caution that I would just give us, is that, and particularly as we live in the world of national performance frameworks and the national, you know, performance arrangements that are in place, I do think some forces might pick this up more quickly than other forces, and so we just need to have a little bit of a mind going forward that, you know, we might not be comparing exactly the same sorts of apples as another force going forward, but it shouldn't be apples and pears, if that makes sense, if that's not too tortuous an analogy. So I suppose the key changes then, just in really plain terms, so where we used to have to record several offences for one potential incident, that will now be, if there's a course of conduct offence, that will now be the course of conduct. So if it's a harassment or a stalking or a control and coercive behaviour in a domestic abuse sort of matter, that will be the offence that we record, and we won't have to record all of the different bits that make up that offence. So there could be 6, 7, 8 offences that won't be recorded now. What that means is that officers aren't then getting notified of 8 different victim notifications. Update your victim. They'll have one. So it will just streamline and simplify that, and it should actually give them the opportunity to really deal with that, you know, that victim in a way that you know is a complete way, you know, that it's not just kind of dealing in narrow silos around each of those different offences. So that's very welcome, and I think the implication will be that our crime volumes will reduce because we won't have the sort of plethora of common assaults or whatever if you know they're associated with that one main offence. So we need to just see. My experience sort of suggests we're just going to have to see how this models itself out and where we get to a new level, a new sort of stability around that. But I think it's a good thing for victims. I think it's a good thing for officers, and victims won't be left, you know, not attended. So that's that. In terms of some lower level offending, so I mean, there is an irony because Section 5 public order offences would have been some of the offences that perhaps we weren't picking up on when we've got a recommendation around making sure that we're recording crime associated with antisocial behaviour. Now that came from the Peel inspection. Now some of those crimes will no doubt have been Section 5, so the very lowest level of public order offences, you know, causing harassment, alarm or distress in the street, you know, shouting and sort of yawping in the street, which is a Section 5 offence. Well, that is no longer a recordable offence. So that's now been implemented. So obviously, in terms of public order offences, we will expect to see a reduction in public, you know, those low levels because they're no longer going to be recorded. That doesn't mean to say that we won't be dealing with the antisocial behaviour that's associated with it. So just really clear message: we will carry on dealing with antisocial behaviour. We're just not going to be recording that as a crime if it's a Section 5 public order. Public Order Act escalates upwards, so Section 5 is the very lowest sort of offence, but it escalates upwards. There's a change in the way that's come into force in terms of how you the additional what was called the rule about how we cancel a crime. If a crime clearly hasn't taken place, it's almost been too difficult to cancel it. And why that's important isn't so that we can make crime look lower, because it's not in our interest to make crime. Our interest is to make crime look the level that it is. But it's just where crime had been reported, in order to be able to get enough what they called additional verifiable information to prove that crime hasn't taken place, was just really disproportionate effort. So people were just filing crimes because it was a waste of their time trying to go to quite a long degrees to cancel it. Well, that has now changed, and so we're applying the new standards. So we can't just cancel it willy-nilly, but we've got new standards that we're applying, which have, and all of these, by happy coincidence, all of this stuff actually comes into play today. This is when the rules have actually changed. And then some other rule changes around malicious communications, which actually we were fairly compliant with already, and that's just around the threshold for what we think, you know, where thresholds are for what actually becomes a criminal offence. So this is to deal with some of your sort of fallouts on Facebook or whatever. So overall, there's some real, I think there's some common sense been applied to the new counting rules, which is very welcome. I'm hoping that this is stage one of many stages. And I think the next step will be, there'll be some work around outcomes, which again, I think if we can do anything to simplify the 22, I think it's 22 outcome codes that we currently have to work towards, that would be very welcome. It will see a reduction in actual overall crime volumes, which I hope will give us the opportunity to focus on those ones that we really need to focus on, and give us all a much clearer picture of what is actually happening in Lincolnshire, so that we can target our resources most effectively.
Thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. I mean, there will be a second stage, as we know. It's going to take a further year to see that stage through, I understand. So we'll see what happens by next year. But a lot can happen in a year, as we know. So we'll deal with the changes as they are now. I suppose the other question is, how do you think that across the county the officers are prepared for the changes that have come in today? Has this been communicated? Because obviously it's difficult. I know you can't sort of extract everybody and give them lots of lengthy training. So we want to obviously release them from the burden of the bureaucracy that now they're free from. But it's how that's been communicated. Do you think there's some issues there still?
Well, I mean, we didn't get the final guidance. Excuse me, we didn't get the final rules actually come through until a week last Thursday. So in all honesty, there has been a bit of a, there's been a bit of pressure to get this delivered under fairly tight timescales. So I would not expect that we're going to be 100% compliant from the start, but the messages have got out there, so it's been communicated through the internet, which again we know is is not the only way that we're trying to communicate it, through our crime management bureau, who actually deal with all of the crime sort of recording in the first instance. So I think it will be, I think messages are out there, but I think it will be a gradual take up until people actually really understand the full implications. So I don't expect us to be, and this is why I think, again, comparing forces going forward will be, will be tricky, because I think forces will be doing this at their own pace.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We'll obviously come back to that in the future and see what difference it's making across the board. Final piece is looking at the force annual plan. So it'd be useful to sort of have an overview of the plan, what you think the key deliverables are going to be from a public perspective, and how that might link through to the police and crime plan delivery. Any comments on that would be great.
Okay, I am going to leave this in Julia's capable hands, because she put this plan together and has worked tirelessly on it on my behalf, but for 2 or 3 months now, maybe a bit longer. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you. And would you believe it won't open up? I'll just get it open. Hang on a second. Let me just find it in my, right, got it opened up. So so I'm not going to go through page, I'm not going to go through page by page, but really what this sets out to do is to start off again with the chief's strategy, because that is the thing that is at the heart of everything that we do, and I think covers everything we do, and is what we're trying to achieve for people, just making Lincolnshire safe. So starting off with that, not really apologetic for the fact that that we start with that, talking about stopping crime and ASB, protecting people from harm and helping those in need. And then the first sort of section of the plan is I'm just sort of moving through the different sections. It is really talking about the governance framework that's in place. So this is where we have the Force Executive Board that is chaired by the Chief, and then we have those 4 main boards that sit beneath that, each of those chaired by a Chief Officer. So the People Board, the Culture Board, Communities and Partnership Board and Capability Board, each chaired by a different Chief Officer who's got responsibility to then feed into and report to the Chief on the Executive Board around the delivery of their plans. So we put that in there for for transparency, I suppose, and to show that kind of governance. We then sort of go through and talk about, there's a piece about assurance there, where we do then link in with the JIAC, the assurance map, which, as you know, we've sort of reviewed and changed, and we did share that last week with the at the risk workshop with the JIAC, which I think was really positive. And then talking through operational performance framework. So where you'll see that this meeting's on that slide. So just in terms of how we manage operational, our operational priorities and how we manage that performance, which is the meeting that I chair, and going through those performance issues. So it then takes us into, and this is really, so this plan is designed, I suppose, in terms of audience. It's designed for anybody who's got an interest in Lincolnshire Police and wants to know what we're trying to do and why and what success will look like. And I think it's a question, Commissioner, that you ask us regularly is, well, what does success look like and how do you know what you're trying to achieve and how would a member of the public know what we're trying to achieve? And this is what this seeks to do. So we do split us up. We do then go through some of the workforce demographics, so police officers and where they're working, police staff, and this is a kind of snapshot in time, but this is generally the allocations into those areas. But it just kind of shows people how many officers and staff we've got and where we have them deployed. And then into some financial planning, which it might have helped if I'd shared my screen just as I talk about this, sorry. So into the financial medium-term financial plan, which we're obviously all very well rehearsed with the money, the budget that we have available to us, which is significant, but obviously we've got a significant amount of work to do within that budget. And then into the priority-based budget. So this is all really background. It's giving people the context of this is what we've got to work with. Here's been our savings plan, which we've gone through that priority-based budgeting piece, and we know we've got those savings to make through that plan. And then in something that just talks about, and I know, again, we're all very familiar with this, but others might not be, but the value for money profile, and this just does really sort of call out the amount of funds that Lincolnshire has available to deliver policing services, and how we are, the lowest funded force per population, per head of population, how reliant we are around the precept. So it's just really worth, I think, having that in. Well, this is why I put that in there, is the context really. And that whilst we do remain very safe in terms of crime and certainly serious crime, we are a very safe force, very safe county. However, because of the numbers of officers that we've got and people we have working for us, we actually have really high workloads for frontline officers. So whilst we're, which was the 7th highest workload nationally, when you look at, basically it's a kind of crime volume against officer volume, that's how we come out as the 7th highest in terms of busyness. And that's, that's comparing us against places like the Met and Greater Manchester Police and West Midlands. So in terms of governance, then what this plan then does is to go into, I spoke earlier about each of those 4 boards, and it goes into the key deliverables, and this plan was set at the start of the year. What we don't say is that if it's not in the plan, it's not going to happen, because we know that things will evolve throughout the year. But I suppose in terms of giving us something that is our framework that we then need to work to and around, this is it. This is when you say, what is it you're seeking to deliver? This is what it is. So in terms of people, we've got the key deliverables in there for our people. That board is chaired by Charlie Rimmer, who's the Director of People Services, and that's sort of key areas that she'll be looking to deliver through that board over the coming year. Communities and partners, so this is ACC Di Coulson, who is leading on that, and you can see the key deliverables within that board, which has things in it. That doesn't look like a big list of things, but actually when you start looking and thinking around police race action plan, violence against women and girls, obviously the new PCSO model and the new neighbourhood model, all of those things are things that will be delivered through that board, and then linking into the partnerships and making sure that our partners are delivering effectively. Culture, I think the Chief has already spoken about culture and the ongoing work around culture, and actually the fact that Lincolnshire is really at the forefront, I think, of policing. To have Chris Davison briefing, the Deputy Commissioner of the Met on what you know, we've been doing here around culture in Lincolnshire is you know, and that was based on, I think, her seeing him speaking at the one of the national Vorg events. So, but you'll see here some of the key things. Now some of these bits, Chris isn't leading on himself, so I'll be doing some of this stuff, but things around, you know, we want to extend the diversity on our scrutiny panels. We want to be doing that because we want to make sure that people are capable of challenging us and that we've got more diversity of the community in terms of challenging around or scrutinising around use of force, stop search. We're revising the ethics panel. So things like this that we'll be looking at to really try to make sure that culture and the direction of travel that we're going with culture is just built upon, and that we you know, that we continue to develop that into the coming year. And then capability. So this is the one that I chair, and it's got a number of features. So these are you know, these are the bits, and again, some of these will feature. Some of these are pretty well done. So deliver a change management office and change governance. Well, that's pretty well almost achieved. That's just now being embedded. But all of those things are things that actually feature within the HMIC Peel inspection around governance. You know, these were the things that were, you know, we've not suddenly done this since Peel. This was work that was ongoing and was being delivered. But we've got a lot then here in terms of what we're going to be doing through the capability board over the coming year. So delivering the, you know, one bullet point, deliver priority-based budget, agreed recommendations. Well, that's going to take us a year to deliver all of them. But yeah, it's a big piece of work, but it's being monitored and tracked through this board. As are all of the HMIC action plan recommendations. So not just the Peel ones, but all of the HMIC recommendations, we're both the ones that are specific to us, so the Peel, serious organised crime and custody, and then those thematic ones, all of them will be reported through the capability board by exception, but I will chair separate meetings for the Peel and the internal ones. Wanting to build upon continuous improvement and innovation, so this is an area that we do want to make sure is really embedded within the force and within the culture. And then that leads into then the further pieces of work. So these report into the capability board, but the issues around estates, fleet. So we know we've got some significant challenges ahead in terms of fleet and the sorts of vehicles that we can or can't be using. And then digital and data. And again, you'll know what a huge area of work this is, trying to ensure that we are fit for purpose in terms of the technology that underpins the delivery of policing. So it's not really about, I mean, it is about the technology, but this is about trying to make sure that our staff have got what they need and have got the best possible tools available to them in order to give that best service to the public, and in order to be, you know, as freed up from bureaucracy and as intelligent, making the best use of intelligence in order to deliver that best service to the public. So they're the deliverables that sit within each of these boards, which will then feed into and report to the executive board on a quarterly basis. And we've sort of mapped these across into the police and crime plan so that we know how they sort of link into the police and crime plan, and some of those specifics that you've got within that plan that obviously that you own and that we work towards. And then at the back, this is just the corporate calendar. So we've kind of given ourselves a again, one of the things within the capability board was to look at the business planning cycle and to make sure that we're aligning as far as we possibly can be all of the stuff that we do. So the force management statement, the strategic assessment, we want all of that to align so that when we get to a period in time where we're saying, right, what's the priorities for next year and what we need to be budgeting for next year. And this is what this corporate calendar seeks to do. So it's got more on it than just business planning, but it's got the kind of where does everything come together so that we can then be planning for the year ahead. So this corporate planning day in September, which actually, ironically, I think we're having a bit early this year, but that's going to be bringing the force management statement, the strategic assessment, and SPR, strategic policing requirement, bringing all of that together so we can then have a kind of gap analysis into, right, what's the priorities going forward for next year. And I think that's it. So as I said at the start, this will get adapted as we go through the year. You know, things will change. There's a possibility that not every single thing that's on that plan will get delivered in its entirety. Well, I know that there's some stuff that won't get delivered. ERP won't get delivered in its entirety that's on that plan, but that's what it's for. So I hope it gives you some clarity around what we're setting off to deliver for the year, and I hope it gives the public clarity as well, so anybody that looks at it can see, you know, this is what we're seeking to achieve.
No, thank you very much for that, and I can see that it's been a significant piece of work to pull all of that together, and it is really helpful, I'm sure, for everybody who's working with it on your side as well, to have it in a single place. But it's very helpful for me, and I'm sure any interested members of the public. Obviously, it doesn't matter what you put in, there'll always be something else that comes along that you need to add in, or you're doing in addition. I fully accept that that's the world that everybody lives in and works in, not least of which fast-pacing one such as policing. I can see Malcolm wants to come in, but there's just one thing I wanted to mention before I let him come in. That's under communities and partners. I'm aware that there's work ongoing, which I'm obviously wanting to work with you on, which is around engaging in a positive way with sort of all of our parishes, districts, towns across Lincolnshire, of which there are many, 507 parishes to be precise. I know there's work underway there, and I do think it's such a key component, being able to have a two-way meaningful conversation ongoing with our volunteer yet elected representatives around the county on behalf of their communities. So I know that this is happening, but it's obviously not in the document, and I wouldn't want anybody to look at this and think that that isn't something that's already ongoing or something that's not important, because I think firstly, I think it's vitally important, but secondly, I know you're already doing it. So I just wanted to get that on record, really, that I knew that was happening. Malcolm.
Thanks, Commissioner. I just wanted to make the point that this plan is a massive step forward, and in terms of understanding and assurance, what really makes it work is that it sits on detailed plans and strategies underneath, so that actually the linkages together, we can for the first time in some time see how it all fits together, and that is absolutely vital, both in terms of articulating it to the public and indeed the policing crime panel questions we were having last week, Commissioner, but also to our own people and the public. And I don't often do this, but I do commend the DCC for the work she's done on this, because it does join it up. And in a sense, she's had to put up with me saying, and where's the for the last few months and doing this. But I think this is, yeah, sorry, I'm not claiming credit by saying that, but this really is together for the first time, and we will work together with the force on all those other documents that require submission both to government and for locally to build on this. But it's a massive step forward, and it makes our job in supporting you, Commissioner, better and much easier.
Yeah, thank you for that, Malcolm. And I do think people often misunderstand the relationship between the Chief Constable and the Police and Crime Commissioner. This whole word around holding to account, it's a supportive process. Where I want Lincolnshire Police to be the most successful that it can be under the leadership of our very good Chief Constable. I don't, you know, nothing else is on our minds collectively. So I think this is really helpful in helping shape the conversations we have to support you in that endeavour. Well, unless there's any other comments, that brings to a close today's meeting, and it just remains for me to thank everybody for their attendance today. Aubrey, can I put you on the spot and ask for when the date of the next meeting is, please?
Tuesday, the 19th of September.
Excellent. 19th of September. Summer will be a distant memory. Children will be back at school and university. Well, not quite university, maybe. But we will look forward to gathering again in September. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.